So, most of us, being U.S. citizens, some of us are, some of us aren't, but the principal connection that we have is that there's a compulsory education mandate for U.S. citizens to be in school at some point. And we vary with geographic location, public versus private versus charter schools, different teaching styles, different state curriculum standards. But all in all, we all have this access to education. And I think that can be a really important tool when it comes to speaking about important issues that come up in our public discourse, especially climate change. So no matter what our approach is to climate change, I think we can use education as an important tool to talk about it and to talk to our students and our kids about it. And in bringing it up in education, bringing up climate change, we can develop an analytical lens to look at the issue. But what I've found is that the general trend in climate change educational programs is that it simplifies the issue. And it makes it so that the approach to climate change education is one that looks at it as a scientific issue. So you have empirical evidence of how to understand it and how to solve it. And then the solutions that are posed within these programs are intrasystemic, that the way that we solve it is still within the capitalist system that we live in, and not really challenging the status quo of what might have caused climate change. So, my proposal is to look at climate change education in a more holistic way, and to see it as something that is an issue and not a problem, as something that has complex roots. People understand it differently, people deal with it differently. That it's a way to work collaboratively, as it is a global issue, we can work together as a global community, and as a way to think creatively about our world. And I think there are different holistic and scientific pedagogical pathways that you could take when you talk about climate change education, and my approach is a holistic one, and so that's what I'll be talking about. The existing and well-known climate change educational programs are both federally and privately funded programs. And federally, we have the Environmental Protection Agency and the Climate Change Educational Partnership. Along with that, the Cool School Challenge is something that some of you may have actually experienced in your education or have been a part of teaching it to students. But that's one of the well-known educational projects within the environmental education community. And in looking at the goals, the activities, the learning objectives, and the resources provided by these programs, I found that they mostly emphasize the scientific frame and intersystemic solutions. So when we look at how one might understand and teach climate change, empirical evidence is what most of these programs are bringing up. That the emphasis is on the use of technology to collect data, to model climate programs, to do further research, and the main components of climate or climate change are carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gas effect. One resource actually defines climate as the long-term average of conditions in the atmosphere, ocean, and ice sheets described by statistics such as means and extremes. I would argue that many other people have different conceptions of what climate is. The goal of the Climate Change Educational Partnership is to understand, assess, predict, and respond to global change. This scientific approach that assumes evidence and proof of climate change will change people's opinions, I think really narrows the discourse and narrows the scope of the way that people understand climate change and how we each have personal and physical and spiritual connections to climate and to the earth as a whole. One of these programs' goals is to prepare a generation of climate scientists, engineers, and technicians to respond to climate change. And again, I believe that narrows the discourse. The Cool School Challenge aims to calculate carbon emissions without looking at individual
and systemic relationships to energy use. So most of these programs, their focus when it relates to humans is that humans cause the problem. Now let's use science to talk about it and to solve it. So when they also talk about solving these issues with climate change, the focus is on behaviors within the current capitalist system. So technological and consumerist options may reduce may reduce carbon dioxide levels, but do they address the people are the cause part of their argument? If we believe that humans are the cause of climate change, I think we need to think about it in a complex way that addresses that relationship, that complex relationship, with more challenging ways of addressing the issues. And by simply turning off our coal-fired electricity lights when we leave the room, or recycling the one-sided sheet of paper that we use, or driving hybrid vehicles. So I think what we need to start looking at with these programs is a way to incorporate more holistic solutions. And I know this is a big term and it's a blanket term, and I acknowledge that this is my jumping off point for this research, and I'd like to take it further and I'd like to delve deeper. So if you have suggestions for ways to go deeper, ways to find more complex resources like I'm talking about complexity, I encourage you to help me with that. So my proposal is to approach climate change in education in a way that allows critical evaluation with holistic and multifaceted lenses to look through and look at climate change. Framing climate change as a problem reminds me of math class, and it reminds me that when you have a problem, you have one pathway to get to one solution, and that's it. And once you get to the solution, hurrah, yay, we found the solution, we're done. So if we frame it this way for students, it implies that once we solve climate change, our life's work is done, and we did what we were supposed to do, and the world is solved. But as Mike Holm, as Carson mentioned earlier, has argued, there's more to that. And so what does our world look like in 50 years if we do get carbon levels in the atmosphere to stabilize and regulate global temperatures? Will there still be war and poverty and indigenous genocide? Or will those things be cured along with climate change as well? Many people say that climate change is a symptom of a greater problem, like greed or oppression. And Mike Holm says that people are vulnerable to climate change because they are poor. They're not poor because of climate change. So how can the idea of climate change, that our biological, our physical, our spiritual, our cultural, our social systems are interconnected, how can that teach us to move forward as a collective unit of people on this planet? I think it's challenging for a lot of us to think about the complexity of climate change, because I think as humans and with our Cartesian Western approach to science, we want to categorize and we want to simplify and we want to have simple solutions and be able to see things in a logical pathway. But the scientific, the cultural, the social evidence of climate change that does exist, people have different perceptions of it. It varies on an individual basis. And so our spatial and temporal and social dimensions complicate the way that we can understand it as a population. We can use it as a vector to teach the value of diversity and to develop a dialogue as opposed to an end-all be-all pathway. The constructivist theory of education argues that no two people understand the same set of information equally. That because of our unique experiences and backgrounds, we will all interpret information in a different way. And so in bringing individual awarenesses and understandings of climate change specifically into education and into a conversation, we can make climate change more relevant to the individuals that are experiencing climate change daily, because we all are. So once we have a conversation and acknowledge that people perceive climate change differently, we can begin to form bonds that lead us to a collective understanding of climate change. And that's not to say that we will ever all agree on what climate change is or how to go about addressing it. But it's an issue that has global causes and global effects, and so we need to look at it as
and have a global response to it. No one nation can separate itself, or no one people can separate themselves from the global community, so I think the approach should be global. So when it comes to education with students, we need to develop skills in working collaboratively so that students are equipped to enter the collective and active discourse on climate change, not only while they're in school, but when they become legal citizens and become decision makers. In developing collaborative skills, we must also look at individual passions and creativity. Varying belief systems and challenges in the physical world are ever present in our reality, and so we need to think about things creatively. There's an active demand for creativity in the public discourse, but I don't think we really foster it in our education system. Larry McCooley was talking yesterday about how we were lined up in rows where it was a teacher lecturing at the students, giving information to them, and it disregards the conversation that can be had. Obama called for a generation that would outbuild, out-innovate, and out-educate the rest of the world. But with a one-sided approach to climate change, how can we really think creatively about the issue? Children are so creative. I mean, everyone knows that. Talk to a child and they tell you something crazy about spaceships and purple and rainbow creatures. And so educators can foster this through a development of multiple intelligences, just addressing that people learn differently. They can encourage exploration inside and outside of the classroom. There can be critical thinking. There can be inquiry from the instructor to the students to create that conversation. As humans, we're born with the gift of a body, mind, spirit, soul, and this planet. And I think our goal is to work together in some way to use those gifts that we've been given to think about our planet in a more holistic way and to think about it as a collective gift that we've all been given. I don't know how to move forward, but I think if we start thinking about it as something more complex than just a science approach, and I think we've all been learning that today already, I think that's a good start. So thank you.